Hello and welcome. This meeting is being recorded and being live streamed now. Please can you all keep your microphones on mute throughout the meeting. This will prevent audio feedback. If you're still getting feedback, please turn off nearby devices. If you'd like to speak, please raise your hand to get my attention. State your name and affiliation before you make a comment. The chat function must not be used for conversations with other participants or provide personal information. All chat is recorded and is part of the formal meeting. Please only use the chat function to alert me you wish to speak or to raise points of order or report technical problems. Officers will try to assist you. This is a formal meeting of Hackney Council. Please note the press and public may be in attendance, and the right of the press and public to record and film this meeting will apply. Number one, we have apologies for absence. I've got apologies from Councillor Joseph and no apologies for lateness. Joining virtually are Councillor Adjera and Councillor Chauhan. There are no other apologies for absence. Item 2, urgent items. There are no urgent items. Urgent 3, item 3, declarations of interest. I don't think there's any declarations of interest to declare at this meeting. Item 4 is the main item on the agenda tonight, which is the part of our scrutiny into carbon net zero and its climate change and buildings. So the Commission has decided to review the Council's work for climate change and the approach being taken to achieve net zero carbon by 2040. The Commission's previous session covered the Council's energy and the role of planning to help shape the built environment and support the Council's ambitions towards achieving net zero carbon. This item will focus on climate change and buildings, looking at Hackney's Council's new homes, regeneration developments and Council's corporate properties. This session will cover council housing, retrofitting council homes to achieve net zero carbon, private sector housing, what the private sector needs to achieve net carbon zero, delivery of new homes, how to build new homes and regenerate developments to deliver net carbon zero, and the Council's strategic property, the Council's maintenance problem, retrofit and work to deliver net carbon zero in relation to non-residential council properties. I'd like to welcome to the meeting the following people. From the London Borough of Hackney, Councillor Claire Mackenzie, Council Cabinet Member for Housing, Councillor Sem Mahima, Mayoral Advisor for Private Centre Renting and Affordability, Alid Richards, Strategic Director of Sustainability and Public Realm, Sam Kirk, Head of Sustainability and Environment, Steve Waddington, Strategic Director of Housing Services, Irina Mott, Assets Manager, Chris Trowell, Interim Director of Regeneration, James Goddard, Interim Director of Regeneration, 2 of them. Chris Pritchard, Director of Strategic Property, Ken Rorison, Head of Strategic Design, Councillor Guy Richardson, Deputy Mayor and Cabinet Member for Housing Supply, Planning, Culture and Inclusive Economy, and Councillor Mette Coburn, Cabinet Member for Energy, Waste, Transport and Public Realm. Also in attendance are the Residents Liaison Group. Welcome Stephen Helder, thank you for coming. Lordship South TMO Chair Sharon West, thank you very much for coming. And Downs Estate Chair Jean Nicholson, thank you very much for coming tonight and we welcome your presence here today. We have a presentation from all the service areas and we'll have a question and answer session after each presentation, following in the following order. So I'd like to ask Alice Richards and Sam Kirk to do an introduction. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Tracy, if you can put the presentation on the screen.
Yep.
Both myself and Sam will do a very, very short introduction showing the context of the climate change agenda for the council, and then we'll hand you over to James Goddard who will deal with private sector housing, and I think we will be breaking for questions after that. If you go to the next slide. Clearly, the climate change agenda is one of the biggest challenges which Hackney Council face, and we are under no illusions. We've got a significant work to do in relation to the climate emergency. Within the corporate plan, climate emergency is an ongoing and increasing priority and will be over the next few years, and achieving wider benefits will be key to this one. I think amongst the biggest challenges we've got, which you will hear within with the service head, is retrofitting buildings, both in terms of just technical complexity scale, but the humongous cost which is associated with retrofitting buildings. We also need to ensure that any of the new homes which we build at Hackney, because we're one of the biggest builders of homes, developers of homes in the borough, need to be as close to net zero as possible and need to be fit for a changing climate and positively contribute to net zero goals. In terms of timeframes, we need to deliver carbon reduction at pace within a narrowing window, and major progress is needed by 2030. Now, in the last scrutiny, you heard about some developments in the energy company and also in planning. But I think tonight we will be concentrating on housing, and probably the most challenging area, but one which would be deliver quite significant gains for the council and in terms of the climate emergency. If you go to the next slide. These are some of the resolutions which the Hackney Council has already done, which officers are working hard in order to deliver. Hackney Council is committed to do everything within its power to deliver against the stretching higher confidence threshold targets set by the IPCC of global warming 1.5 degree target. We also require to get a 45% reduction in carbon dioxide equivalent emissions against 2010 levels by 2030, and net zero emissions by 2040 across the council's full range of functions. Further, the motion passed the full council also committed the local authority to seek opportunities to make even greater contribution than its headline decarbonisation targets wherever possible. 2040 is the target, but we are doing everything possible to reach net zero before that 2040. I'm going to hand you over to Sam now, who will give you just an overview of the baseline emissions we've got and the scale of the task in hand.
Thanks, Alid, and thank you, everybody. As Alid said, I'm just going to set the scene with a few slides. So if you can go on to the next slide, please, Tracy. What this graph shows is the modelled pathway for borough-wide emissions, which has been developed by our consultants, Borough Happold, supported by a wider officer group that has been meeting to go over this. It builds on the earlier work we did on our own functions for a pathway to net zero by 2040, based on the declaration that Alid has just gone through. We already have a set of targets for our own functions, although scope is quite contained, but it is also ambitious by including the embodied carbon, for example, associated with the construction materials from our own housing developments. On this graph, you'll see the green and orange bar at the left-hand side, and these are the classic emission sources of transport, domestic and non-domestic energy and heating, waste processing and new buildings. Then you'll see the largest amount there, which accounts for approximately, well, over 70% of our emissions, is the resource consumption emissions. And this is mostly down to individual choices, and how we can influence that will be key, but also difficult to measure its impact. It's not currently modelled in our net zero pathway. Just to go what those consumption emissions are, it's what people are consuming with regards to water, food and drink that they purchase and eat, electronics, and even down to the where they have got their pensions and other financial management that they've got. When we were doing this work with Borough Happold, there's 3 pathway scenarios were assessed for what we can impact. the no action, which you'll see that line, the top line going across over to 2040, the current policy, and the radical stretch. Our current policies on emissions in scope make a reduction, but it won't even be enough for net zero by 2050, which is the current government target. If you just want to go to the next slide, please, Tracy. The balance between our own emissions and influencing the reduction of borough-wide emissions is a key consideration in the climate action plan that we're currently developing. Our ability to make carbon reductions is based on what we can control or influence. And as you can see from this pie chart, the things that we're directly responsible for accounts for 5% of our local area emissions, excluding the bulk of our own social housing portfolio, but including about a third of our strategic property portfolio. However, we have many levers that can be used to deliver wider local action to reduce emissions and prepare local areas for a changing climate, particularly through leadership and placemaking. Then that dark grey area, that's about a further 25% of emissions that we have strong influence over. From a built environment perspective, we would be considered to have high influence over new housing and social housing activities, medium influence over the private rented sector, and low influence over owner occupiers and small and non-domestic properties. Much of the remainder, the other that we mentioned on the previous slide, is associated with consumption emissions, where our leverage may be more variable, as most decisions lie with individuals. So, for example, waste we have higher leverage over because we can put systems in place that make people think about reducing their waste and recycling more, but we've got much less influence over activities such as whether people take personal flights or not. Next slide, please, Tracy. This is the process map that's been put together from LEDNet and London councils, and it identifies key stages for addressing our climate emergency declaration. We are in a range of different places on this roadmap, undertaking tasks at all of the different stages. So, for example, with regards to data, we've got the net zero energy strategy, the green infrastructure strategy, local nature recovery plan, and the borough emissions assessment and targets development that I spoke about on the previous slides. Some are at early stages of delivery due to their complexity, such as the social housing retrofit, and we're gathering more evidence to understand the realistic pathway to net zero. And other stages are already well underway. For example, around actions, we've implemented low traffic neighbourhoods, we've got active transport, we've done residual waste collection changes, urban tree planting, and we're commissioning for electric vehicle charging. And throughout all of this, we need to engage stakeholders through the whole process. And this has already begun with the recent Green Recovery event that we held, and also other events that we've got planned, such as the Climate Summit, which we are going to be holding early next year. I'm now going to hand over to James.
Thanks, Sam. Hope you can all hear me. Thanks, Tracy. So you can see everybody in front of you a picture there of the Hackney housing strategy. I just thought I'd plug it just because it's a good old read. The point being also that tonight we are covering, as a context here, you'll hear from me in the next few slides, not just private sector housing, but I'm going to set the context out for all of the housing in Hackney. Just a brief summary of where we are. As a reminder, the Hackney housing strategy is responsible for all tenures of all housing in all of Hackney. So some details in that document. We will be producing a new one, but I'll move on throughout the whole presentation now. Next slide, please, Tracy. We have worked through London housing directors with a couple of research agencies, one Parity Projects, another one called Etude, who have done a lot of work across the whole of London, borough by borough, to provide some of the data that you're about to see. So they're the two research agencies. You may be familiar, there was a news item about 2 or 3 weeks ago. Mayor Glanville indeed presented this, where there was a figure of 98 billion that was presented for the cost of retrofitting to homes throughout London. That 98 billion figure comes from these documents. More on that later. Next one, please, Tracy. Thank you. Baseline summary, just to set the context out of where we all are. This is quite useful in terms of this. These figures, they change on a day-to-day basis, so don't take them as gospel. They're a snapshot, but the point at the moment is that they give you a good indication. Around 123,000 homes in Hackney. That is homes of all tenure. You can see there from the build date, it's quite interesting. Conservation areas, 27,000, which is higher than the average for London. So around 22% of our properties in Hackney are higher in conservation areas, which is higher than London type. It gives you, that bottom line shows you what the most common type of property in Hackney is. Built between 1900 and 1930, flat type, in the middle of a terrace with a solid brick wall. By far and away the majority of heating systems are boilers, and the main fuel for that is mains gas. That is the average property in Hackney, as you'll see as we go through it. Next slide, please, Tracy. It's a bit small, and I have to squint at the screen, but this top graphic tells you what the property types are that you will encounter in Hackney. So over 3/4 of the housing stock in Hackney is a flat. Flats are by far and away the most common form of home in Hackney. We do have houses, about 5,000 of them. They are mainly terraces. And indeed, when we did this piece of research in the summer, we counted 149 bungalows. Just a point, that will have changed up and down, but by far and away the most common stock type in Hackney is a flat. We are hugely flatted. The average at the bottom, the Sap rating, which is an indication of environmental and energy efficiency. The Sap rating for Hackney on average is there. We've got a low 1.3% are in the F&G, which is not that good, but it's lower than London. So we'll come across Sap ratings as we go throughout the presentation this evening. Next one, please, Tracy. Type of wall construction. There's a reason why we're putting the wall construction up here, because we take a fabric first approach, as you'll hear throughout the evening, to property. Walls are key there, heating systems, walls, PVs, things like that. Solid brick, solid walls are by far and away, again, the most common in Hackney in terms of our construction. As you can see, where we have cavity walls as well, nearly 75% of those cavity walls are uninsulated.
Go now.
Oh, sorry, I just, usual thing, what's acronym? What's SAP, S-A-P?
SAP, sorry, because it stands for the Standard Assessment Procedure. It is a completely terrible an acronym, you're right. So Standard Assessment Procedure is a method, simply put, of kind of defining where a property is in terms of energy efficiency. All councils, all local authorities in the country report that figure back as part of the Home Energy Conservation Act findings. So in summary, it gives you a measure of how efficient or inefficient a property is. The scale is 0 to 100. The lower the number, the better. Yep. So the higher the number, the worse. We average, I think, 62. An average figure for Hackney is about 62. So you will see throughout the presentation this evening plans in place to bring those SAP ratings towards 0. Throughout you'll hear, councillors, is that part of our challenge is getting in place a number of real meaningful measurements across this whole area of work. At the moment, they're quite a blunt instrument, and I'll come back to this in a minute when I summarise the private sector stuff. But you'll hear this from anyone, any borough, any professional, anyone involved with retrofitting about what the various measurements we want to use, can use, and would like to move are. But the Standard Assessment Procedure gives you an energy efficiency rating, councillor.
I've read it 3 times and I don't understand. It says solid walls are the most common and most uninsulated, and nearly 3/4 of cavity walls are insulated. Oh, so they're different sorts of walls.
Yeah. So what we got.
I've read it out loud. It makes sense. Sorry.
So yeah, there are 2 main types of wall, councillor. One is a solid brick wall. The other type of wall is 2 layers of brick with a cavity in the middle. They're the main types of wall. Most walls in Hackney are one single skin wall, one solid brick type wall. What it makes a difference for is because if you're insulating a single brick wall, you tend to have to use cladding down the outside, or the inside, but mainly on the outside. If you are insulating a cavity wall, you tend to fill the cavity up with something like polystyrene or some form of insulation. So that's why it's important. By far and away, most of the walls in Hackney, as you can see from that graphic, are either one single solid brick wall, or they are 2 layers of brick with a cavity in the middle. System built walls, the blue portion, are modern. A system wall is where, mostly in the modern stock, where you will have a wall that is built with layers of sandwich between structure, between insulation, between fireproofing. They're complicated, they're expensive, and they're more modern. Again, system built walls can be a problem where you'll have heard in the press whereby the fire insulation layer is problematical and it's sandwiched between two other layers, and we've got to get the fire insulation out. That's another story, but that's a system wall. We have some timber frame and the rest of it. We've got 14 granite walls. I don't even know where they are in truth, Guitar Council, but there are 14 granite walls in the whole of Hackney. Interesting, but there you go. Next one, please, Tracy. This again is a fairly straightforward graphic. It shows you what the main heating systems are across all property, all homes, all housing types in Hackney. As you can see, it's blue, it's boilers. No surprise, this should not come as a surprise to anybody. But by far and away, the greatest heating system in Hackney is a boiler. That again lays down the scale of the challenge facing, the move away from boilers to heat, air source pumps, etc. It just graphically illustrates there what we've got in Hackney. So approximately over 100,000 boiler systems. We come down through things like room heaters, storage heaters, community heating, electric, and you'll see that heat pumps are coming in towards the bottom. Our general task is to move the heat pumps towards the top and away from boilers. But don't underestimate the challenge here, as you'll see in some of the figures later. So yes, boilers in Hackney are by far and away over 90% of heating systems present in Hackney constitute a gas individual boiler. Thanks, Tracy. This is just a graphic showing you where by tonnage, where the average release with the highest CO2 areas mapped in the borough. Again, straightforwardly, it appears on the graphic to if you can see that, I hope you can see it, but the highest CO2 tonnage is coming from the north of the borough. There are some hotspots, but that's mainly from the north. Not surprising, simply because the property type in the north of the borough, there are more houses up there, there are more Victorian houses up there, there are more Victorian flats than there are in the south of the borough. Hence, in theory, there's that close relationship between CO2 tonnage and that property type. Not a surprise to us. More on this later. Thanks, Tracy. This is a heat map of property types in Hackney. By heat, I don't mean how hot the properties are, but this is where the properties are. So as you can see, there's a really equal spread of socially rented and private rented. Those two types of tenure, as well as owner occupation, are present throughout the whole of Hackney. You can see the conservation areas on the far right. This is important to us, this kind of mapping at geographical level, because we know where we want to target first. So these are just summary maps of everything on top of what you can see the data there. But this is important to show you the work that's been done that underlies this at GIS, at geographical information system levels. We've got it down really, really quite detailed levels. Thanks, Tracy. Summary. So this is an indication of some of the costs that are involved. So you've seen we've got 123,000 homes across the borough. You've seen they're mainly made of solid walls with heating system, gas individual boilers present. This gives you some idea, some indication of the costs that we think it would take to retrofit the stock in Hackney to net zero. All stock. These are averages. The column on the left, pathway one. Pathway one is a sort of an intermediate period in time to get us to the net zero target of 2038. So we won't go. I'm not going to take you through pathway one first, but I'm going to simply summarise pathway two. The full 123,000. The average spend is 2.746 billion. Billion, not million, but billion. So these are big numbers. The average investment per property is 22,300. That is an average. It will be much higher in much of the privately owned and private rented parts of the stock. Okay, it will be less in other parts of the stock. So that's an average. This is what we're dealing with at the moment. And you can see below that how it takes some of the improvements and takes some of the figures down. But we mustn't underestimate the financial scale of the challenge. That's our biggest issue at this stage. These are huge numbers just for Hackney. They may be bigger than that. They may be slightly smaller than that. We'll refine these as we go on. But at the moment, indications are around 2.7.5 billion quid in Hackney investment. I'll leave it there for one moment. But as I say, it's a big figure. And that's our portion of the 98 billion. Next slide, please, Tracy. Net zero pathway. If you look at the 3 blocks on the right-hand side, this is where the money is going, that 2.7.5 billion. Mainly in heating and hot water systems. The orange point at the top, where you can see that's 1.5 billion worth of work we need to do. Below that are fabric improvements, that's insulation by and large. So insulation again is really important across Hackney, and again a spend of about nearly £1 billion there. The yellow point, frankly, is photovoltaic. Literally means solar panels. So that's the amount of investment we need to put into solar panels, 300 million quid worth of solar panels on property to keep the costs and to keep the energy down. Total, that adds up to the 2.7 or 6 billion, I should say, actually. That's wrong, but that M should be $1 billion. So again, that's where that big figure comes from. Heating systems first, fabric and solar panels. Thanks, Tracy. That was a summary of the overall overarching stock. And I'm going to take you just quickly through the private sector component, which is where, as Alid and Sam pointed out on their first slides, really where the challenge lies for us. You'll hear from colleagues later about the social stock, our council stock, and you'll hear about our new build. That we are, in a sense, going to learn from what colleagues say around the council stock and what we can do there as lessons learned for how we can bring this stuff back into the private stock, because it's very, very difficult. Sam also distinguished between, when she had that third slide there, that there is also a complete difference in terms of influence between the rented stock and the owner-occupied stock. And it's absolutely correct, as Sam pointed out, we have more leverage over the rented stock than we do over the owner-occupied stock for obvious reasons. Even then, our leverage over rented is not as great as we would like it. The private rented sector in Hackney, it's about 35,000 units of private rented as we speak. That figure's gone up hugely over the last 10, 20 years. We've had the fastest growing stock in the UK, actually, as I've presented at previous meetings. These are the key issues that we face, particularly when we think about retrofitting. Firstly, multiple owners. One building can have a renter in it, a private occupier, and a housing association tenant, for example, in one building. That's a complication we find throughout private rented stock, and you have to get everybody agreed to do what you need to do to that building. It's complicated. Another structural point is that we have a different approach between owners and occupiers. Occupiers, the renters, are perfectly happy to have retrofitting taken out on their building. It makes cheaper bills, it makes the place warmer, etc., etc. If you are a landlord, and remember that nearly 85% of landlords in Hackney are amateur landlords, not institutional, not professional landlords, but they are amateurs. These are people that own between 1 and 3 properties and rent them out in an amateur basis. Some of these properties is going to cost tens and tens of thousands of pounds to retrofit, over £50,000 per property. If you are a landlord, do you have an incentive to do that? Landlords are telling us in other boroughs in Hackney that they're just going to sell their stock. It's too expensive, just can't do it. Not worth it. You cannot put that amount of investment onto the rent either. You just price yourself out of the market. So we'll see how this goes, but there is a completely different incentive between the landlord and the occupier. Point 3, transient population. This is a key point again. The private rented sector has a very, very mobile population. Tenants come, tenants go. That's a function of 2 things. Firstly, rubbish tenancies across the private rented sector. In Hackney, our better renting campaign has meant that we offer much longer tenancies, and we get landlords to do a much longer tenancy as well. But it's still there's no comparison between the private sector and the social stock, where you have a much more transient population. That makes it difficult to engage with people. Sometimes it makes it difficult to hear what people's views, etc., etc. But we need to bear that in mind. 4th point: the private rented sector in Hackney it essentially comprises the older and the more complicated properties. We are talking the Victorian and earlier street property stock in Hackney is vastly comprises the private rented sector. That's the stuff that is complicated and expensive to retrofit. Single walls, difficult boiler systems, etc. It's expensive. Subsidence, all those things come into play here. Your fire safety works you're having to do are contradictory to the energy efficiency works and all that stuff. So the costs on these buildings are quite high. We also find the 4th point, there is a complicated relationship between fuel poverty and energy efficiency, where behaviours and something like that come in. So again, we are looking at a new approach to the private sector in terms of fuel poverty. Regulation. The private rented sector is in certain respects a wild west in comparison with council stock and housing association stock. This goes to the heart of government. There's very little control, very little protection. It doesn't have a particularly regular basis like the other tenures do. Where there are forms of regulation, where there are forms of stuff that councils have put in, there's the difference between, for example, registration, good landlord registration schemes and licensing schemes. In Hackney, we have a licensing scheme. Again, that can be very complicated. You'll hear additional licensing, you'll hear selective licensing, you'll hear mandatory license. A lot of people don't even know what this stuff is, and that's landlords included. But we in Hackney have a licensing scheme that gives us a good basis to start here, because one of the things we can think about using is, in order to get a license, you have to hit some of these retrofit standards or you won't get a license. More on that as we go through it. Housing market and values, again, could have an impact upon housing market values. Property prices go up, down. This impacts how things are done and the supply, generally speaking, which comes to that last point where we need to keep an eye on this, because I've been hearing from housing associations particularly, and some landlords as well, in Hackney and out of Hackney, that retrofitting is being used as a thing with which to look at how they do their stock. In other words, they'll start selling stuff off that they think is a bit tricky or a bit complicated or needs a bit too much investment. So we could have an impact upon the market there. Final slide from me, please, Tracy. This is in a nutshell. This is really where the core thing comes down to in the private sector, the rented sector, is the financial considerations. We are trying to lobby government to front load all the work that's done here. Learn from what councils do with their own stock, indeed even learn from what housing associations do with their own stock, and then get the money into the system so that private landlords can start investing. Grant, you name it, we are really, really lobbying government on this point. Without that, it's going to be very difficult. Another point is the energy performance standards, how they relate to the financial considerations. At the moment, we've got different and not quite wieldy energy performance indicators. Final bullet point there is how you can do things differently. Green loans, transition funds, much better advice. All of this is needed in order to get the private sector off the ground. It exists to an extent with council and within the public sector. It doesn't exist at the moment in any shape or form within the private sector. I've gone through that at a rate of knots. Council member, is there anything you want to say at this point? And then I'll come back.
Yeah, just very briefly to say that obviously a lot of this is really important for us to meet our targets around net zero. But I think there is a piece of work that the Commission could possibly contribute to for developing this idea as we look to the next administration, in terms of making sure that we're able to evolve our levers around the private rented sector. And I think that point that James has already made about learning from what the social rented sector do in terms of retrofit, and then applying that where possible to landlords. So, for example, the majority of our landlords are private individuals who are maybe saving for a pension or so on. And is there a piece of work to be done for the council, for others, around lobbying to make sure that there is front loading of or reintroduction of things like feed-in tariffs, and making sure that there is funding upfront for those people to invest, so that there's an incentive to retrofit and also reduce the bills of their tenants. As James has said, there is a crossover with fuel poverty, particularly in the south of the borough. I think Kings Park is a particular area. So I think there's lots of multiple benefits to come from this, but really a big part of this is to incentivise landlords in the private rented sector. So I'll leave it there.
Councillor Patrick.
Thank you, Councillor Mahima. Have you finished your presentation now, James? Have you said everything?
I finished, Councillor Patrick. Yeah, Chair. Ready for questions?
Okay, thank you very much. So you've talked about you and Councillor Mahima have talked about the private rented sector and the private sector. Obviously, as you said, landlords have different aspirations for their properties as to homeowners, but I just wondered whether we talked about influence earlier. Obviously, we've got influence over owners that rent their properties that need a license, and we can use that as a way of pushing them towards upgrading their properties towards net carbon. But not all rented properties in the borough need a licence. So I wonder how we're going to talk to those owners. But also people that own owner-occupiers that live in their own homes. The government has given out very mixed messages. I was hearing today about the green grants and the total failure of the green grants, that most of them have had to be returned unspent because either builders can't get the equipment, the air pumps and the equipment, or that the time was too short for them to be spent effectively. So it seems like that even when the government said they were trying to help owner occupiers, that hasn't gone down very well because the grants couldn't be funded. I mean, I don't know what the government plans are for owner occupiers or landlords, if any. Perhaps you could advise us if there is, but also what the council can do in the way of advice and to owner occupiers and landlords about actually how they can do it to their property, what they can do to their properties and in what stages. I mean, it's a massive commitment. As you said, you're looking at probably £22,000 at minimum for a property, and I'm sure our older properties, our Victorian properties, will cost a lot more. So what can we do as a council to influence people and also give them advice on the best way of going about this if they do want to go about this?
Shall I take that, Councillor Memia? So, Councillor Patrick, thank you. I'll take them slightly in reverse order. I'm trying not to be facetious, Councillor Patrick. Well, I was going to say, if you hear from the government what they plan to do, perhaps you could let me know. Actually, sorry to say that, but that kind of answers that question at this stage. In reverse order. So you're absolutely correct. The 22,000.
You as an officer might know something more than I know as a member of the public.
Yeah.
I thought you knew everything, James.
Yeah, well, we try, Councillor, but I'll say this one, knock on the government's door, wall of silence. I'm straightforward, I'm record there. We don't know at this stage. I don't think the government does not have a policy, a plan or strategy for this stuff at this stage. Yeah, it does, but nowhere near what we need to do. Councillor, you pointed out some of the points there. The £22,000, 22,000 is an average figure. It will be more than that. It will be more than that. Yeah, heat pumps alone are coming in at £5,000 minimum. Yeah, you've seen all that stuff. The green loans was a good idea, badly implemented. So we are lobbying government to make sure again, green loans, green grant is a good idea, but do it properly. Invest in it properly. Get this stuff done. Without that, it's going to be very difficult to make anything work. Advice: private sector housing team in Hackney. We at the moment offers advice on how to how best to approach your property from a fabric and behavioural angle in order to make it energy efficient. We do that already. We do that all the time. We need to do much more of it. We don't have the team resources at this stage to handle all of the queries that we get in. So one of the things to look at is the resources the council has in order to offer advice to anyone who asks us, particularly owner occupiers, because that's where we're starting to get the queries from, even more than the landlords. It's something for us to look at. We simply do not have capacity, council, to deliver that advice at the moment. We do have that function in the council, just simply is nowhere near big enough as a point. Your first question was about licensing. Again, I'm not going to pull any punches here. The licensing scheme exists in Hackney in 3 wards. We've always planned to look at that geographical spread. We'd like it, some of us would like it, across the whole borough, or certainly wider. Councillor Member will say more about this if I get this wrong, but we'd like that across the whole borough. 2 points. Number one, the current licensing scheme doesn't have as a condition things like retrofitting in there. We can add that, but there's a key point here. In order to get a licensing scheme in place, you need approval of the Secretary of State himself, because it's been a him lately. You need the Secretary of State's approval to get a licensing scheme in place, let alone a licensing scheme as we would like it that has retrofitting as a condition of that license. You need to get approval from the Secretary of State. Every single licensing scheme that was presented to the last Secretary of State over the last 2.5 years was refused. we have no idea where the current Secretary of State goes in terms of licensing schemes. So let's not at this stage get too excited about where we go with our licensing scheme. We want to, and we will push, and we will make every single case for a broader licensing scheme with energy efficiency, retrofitting, tackling fuel poverty as part of the condition. We're going to do that. You'll see more of that, but it's in the hands of the Secretary of State. Councillor Member?
Yeah, if I could just add to that. So I guess one thing to bear in mind with everything that we do around private sector housing here in the borough is that we're one of the few boroughs that actually does this properly. In other areas, I've been working with James and officers around fire safety and cladding to advise leaseholders. There is a separate issue around, I guess, in the back of my mind, and I think for all of us as councillors, is that a third of the borough is in the private rented sector. One of the biggest concerns that I have, and I think many others should have, is that should there be, as James has said in the presentation, a tenure shift, then a third of our borough is immediately homeless. And that is clearly not an issue or a situation that we want to be in. We want to make sure that we have the means and the ability and the capacity right now to be working with private sector landlords. And some of that is down to resourcing and staff time and thinking about, I suppose, if the committee continues its work, the comparison of the scale of the private rented sector compared to the social sector in the borough. It's not massively different, and we're projected to be about 40% by 2030. And we have, I would say, not even a quarter of the staffing of the council housing team. And that's not to say that we should reduce those resources, but I think within the work that we do, when we look at the budgeting, some of that 2.7 billion is about resourcing to make sure that we have the staff and we're able to do things like advise landlords and owners and owner-occupiers. The other thing I would say is that in our work in the last 3 months, we've been following closely the comprehensive spending review and the offer that has made to the housing market. And it's virtually none, if I'm kind of saying that politely, James, because we're being recorded. But it's not been great for the housing sector, irrespective of tenure. And so there is a lot of work to be done about putting some meat on the bones of what the government has been saying about retrofit and their obligations around net zero this week at COP26.
Before I bring in BLC, perhaps you mentioned housing associations very briefly, James, and you know this committee has looked at housing associations and their relationship with the council in the past. I just wondered whether we'd started talking to the housing associations in Hackney. Obviously, a lot of them are very large housing associations, and the Hackney properties are only a small part of their overall property holding. But I wonder whether there had been any discussions with any of the housing associations about them looking at plans to retrofit any of their properties. You talked about maybe some of them might sell properties rather difficult. That's something we need to take on board if that happened. But I wonder whether there was any working together as the social housing sector between us as a housing authority and the housing associations. I mean, us in this room know that they're very separate, but in lots of people's eyes that they're all social and affordable housing. And lots of people I sometimes find don't even know that they're housing association tenants and think they're council tenants for some strange reason. No, they pay their rent to a housing association.
Yeah, Councillor, I find that particular point quite a lot of the time too. But no, yes, so we have spoken and we are speaking, you'll be glad to hear, with housing associations in Hackney about a number of things. Firstly, joint projects. Secondly, exemplar, i.e. good examples of how you can retrofit a property, and we can learn from each other in terms of costs, in terms of materials, in terms of supply chain, in terms of what works and what didn't work. We're looking at that through the Housing Association Forum. Thirdly, where we have areas of concern, and one of those areas of concern I had in the presentation, which is that some have already mentioned they may have to, in inverted commas, rationalise parts of their stock because it will be too expensive. So we are working with housing associations on the good news and the bad news side of things. Again, there's quite a lot of work going on there. They're not in a dissimilar position to a council in terms of their stock type, in terms of what they've got to do and when they've got to do it by. But what we'll be doing through the forum is keeping an eye quarterly on where the retrofitting projects are with the different housing associations. Again, bearing in mind, as you know from our previous scrutiny, we've got an enormous number of housing associations in Hackney, but only about 15 to 20 of which are actually relevant and worthwhile. So we are working with them to look at what they're doing and what they're not doing. Indeed, we've supported 3 of the smaller housing associations for schemes for grant funding for retrofitting, including, for example, ISHA, Islington and Shoreditch Housing Association. I've recently been in contact last week, in fact, with the Gudas Israel for a joint approach to retrofitting on their stock with ours as well. So yes, early days yet. I can report back as we go through the scrutiny.
Thank you very much. Does any other member want to come in before Councillor Rathbone?
Thanks very much, James. An amazing presentation, just incredible. The amount it's going to cost. Just got 3 questions. I mean, one is really to, as it were, our communications director, which is how do we persuade people to change their lifestyle? Because that's 69% or whatever it is of others, including private freeholders and leaseholders and so on. How do we persuade them to change their lifestyle and their boilers? Secondly, I just wondered, following on from what the chair was saying, whether you've had any ideas that maybe private landlords will just start selling off their properties because they don't actually want to carry out all of this work. Where would the council be placed in terms of buying those properties? And then finally, just to inquire really whether our heat and light company could carry out the work right across the borough for both the private sector as well as the public sector. So I'm looking in the wrong place. Whether, that the company that we've set up or something else that we could set up, which actually would get that work done, maybe get it done at a reasonable rate, but get it done thoroughly and properly, obviously linked up.
Thanks, Councillor Rathbone. I'll do your questions in the order you raised them. Yeah. Question number 1, you've hit the nail on the head. You're absolutely right about how lifestyles, etc. Anecdotally, in the council I was working before I came to Hackney, we actually retrofitted an entire estate, but we couldn't understand why then housing bills, heating bills were going through the roof and why it was still also energy efficiency. Again, it was the way people lived and behaviours. There's an interesting point, if you look at fuel poverty, all the studies are that behaviours and the way people actually live, the way we all live, are as important, if not more important, than some of the physical stuff we can actually do. So you're absolutely right. The good thing is we are aware of this. The good thing is there's an awful lot of study out there. The good thing is there's an awful lot of things we can communicate. Where it becomes tricky is actually delivering that message and implementing it. There was something in the news today, I was reading this morning actually, where on a survey whereas most people think that they would happily accept more in the way of restrictions, was the phrase, on their lifestyle, people should accept. When it came to the individual household, we're not happy to accept restrictions. So it's quite a contradiction in how we approach things. But you're absolutely right. And we will need to get that message in terms of behaviour landed. There are some positive things we can do there in terms of behavioural studies. So we know that we know what we can do when we work with people. We know what advice we can provide. But you're absolutely spot on in terms of that. And more to come back as well on that thing. I think you're right. When you also ask, so whether we've heard whether landlords are going to potentially sell off their property, the reality is that some will. They absolutely will, because when you look at the figures, 85% of our landlords are, as council member pointed out, probably there for the pension pot or otherwise. Many of those are not going to be able to afford 50, 60, 70,000 pound retrofits per home that they've got. It doesn't stack up. It doesn't stack up at all. It just won't work. I don't know what they'll do. They will, we'll work with them, we'll persuade them. By that time they come, maybe the green grants will be working. This is off down the line, so maybe they won't need to sell them. But as a last resort, it may be that they'll have to sell. Some landlords have said to us that they will sell. You're right, the council may be able to buy them, and we will look at that. Maybe the Hackney Housing Company could buy them. We'll look at that too. I assume if you've got a property that hasn't been retrofitted, the market value will fall or will come down. So there might be something that we can or can't do around that. This is all we'll have to look at, and it's all about budgets. It's all about what works and what doesn't work over the long term. It's something we can look at, though. There's no guarantee at this stage because the cost could be enormous, as you've seen from the presentation. We'll just have to see how that goes, and there could be a 10-year impact. Again, we'll have to see how that goes. And your final point about the Hackney Housing, the energy company. The energy company isn't set up at this stage necessarily to undertake the kind of fabric works. That doesn't mean to say it might not look at that. I know other councils are using where they've got energy companies, ESCOs, energy service companies. Some councils are looking at whether they can extend the role of their energy service company into these more sort of physical retrofitting works, as well as providing advice and stuff like that. Again, we can look at that. We're not set up to do that at the moment. The way that we've approached it is for our own DLO, for our own supply chains, etc. But you're absolutely correct to raise that point, and I will, again, I'll talk to officers and we'll come back to you throughout the course of this scrutiny on what we may be able to do there. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. I've got we've still got a lot of people to hear from, so I'm going to take Councillor Adjera and Deirdre Worrell, and then we're going to move on to Steve Waddington, the Director of Housing, and Councillor Clayton Mackenzie about our own retrofitting council properties.
Thank you, Chair. I'll be very quick. Sorry, James, I can see that there's amazing work going on and we're kind of geared up to meet our challenges in terms of climate change. You touched upon it briefly in respect of housing associations and the challenges there, but also in relation to lobbying. And I just want to find out whether we as an authority can collectively start to lobby the government, because it's quite clear that there are no funding streams in place to kind of support this work in the long term. And as a councillor, I think one of the complaints I've heard or I regularly receive from people is increases in service charges in respect of our housing associations and cladding work at the moment, and also from some council tenants in respect of Section 20 notices and them not being able to afford it. So I do think this aspect of our undertakings needs to be adequately funded. And can we do it collectively? I know this is all kind of in the planning stages at the moment, but I do think there's a need for a strong push in ensuring we get the money we need to do this. Thank you.
Yep, thank you, Councillor Adjari. Well said. I don't disagree with anything that you've said there. Again, a really good question, as they've all been tonight, and you've hit the nail on the head too. Early days, what we've been doing in Hackney, first of all, and I'll broaden it out. So Hackney, through the Better Renting campaign, we are class leading here. Make no mistake, Councillor Hackney's done really well. We lead, we campaign, we lobby, we don't stop, we make as much noise as possible. We will use our Better Renting campaign, and we are using it to bring in things like the fire safety and the retrofitting components, and we'll carry on doing that. And happy to talk. I say council members led this excellently from the front, along with support from the mayor and cabinet colleagues, as well as councils generally. But that's a fantastic campaign that we've already got in place to continue our lobbying as a borough. Number one. Number two, we have lobbied at the London level with fellow boroughs through things like the London Housing Directors Group and London Councils and through the GLA. So yes, we are. Again, there's probably much more we can do in terms of our campaigning and how we do that. Again, and I'll take council members' lead there, as I'll take yours. But I agree with you. There's much more we can do as a collective group on that sort of side of things as well. And your final point about service charges and stuff, absolutely correct as well. Councillor Muema and I get this, as casework constantly. And we're dealing with ludicrous fire charges from people who's no thought of their own. These are residents. These are the people who have bought. These are people who live in properties. They've gone through everything, and suddenly you get a charge of thousands and thousands of pounds. We are, as we speak, we've been having to deal with this in Hackney, and we'll carry on having to deal with this. Again, it comes back to your lobbying point. When you've got a government that doesn't have a clear policy or a different plan here, all we can do is lobby for change. At the moment, the law is not on our side, but we'll carry on doing that. And I'm happy outside of this to take yours and council members' lead on how we can better lobby as well.
Yeah, I just before my battery dies, I just wanted to add, Councillor Adajari, that James and I actually just met today to talk about an update to the Better Renting campaign. I'd be very happy to speak to you and other members of the committee to make sure that we have a stream in there as we look to the new year, but also into the new administration about retrofit, and make it explicit in what some of the work that we do, some of the advice that we can provide. I think there is a piece of work in there about we need to have a proper risk analysis about if we are in a position where somebody is, for example, a leaseholder, somebody's a landlord, that money is rechargeable to somebody somewhere. And so I think your point about the experiences we've all had around fire safety, and we don't want to kind of compound issues around doing something good through, for example, trying to deal with retrofit and passing that on to leaseholders or to tenants. And so we need to make sure that that lobbying strategy is a really strong one. I'm probably, weirdly, a little bit more hopeful than James about the responsiveness of the government at this moment in time. There's an opportunity with a new Secretary of State who is a bit more of a serious human being to look at what are the options available to local government. We have in the past had meetings with permanent secretaries from the department, and I do think that there is scope to influence at the margin some of what we need as a borough. I think where we sometimes do get slowed down is when we're working with the rest of London, which is necessary, but it does mean a slower pace for our own residents here in Hackney. But I think that's the way to bring about that change, hopefully by 2030.
Deirdre, you've had your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to make the point around the potential purchase of private rented properties, or from landlords who want to divert, to get rid of properties, or housing associations. I think the key point to note is the huge financial challenges. Even using right to buy receipts to buy a property at market value, the rent that we would get through social rent would only pay the interest. You'd never pay the debt back. And the capital resources that we have, we want to target on maintaining the housing stock we have, and also, we have got a retrofit mounting as well. So I just want to sort of manage expectations in the fact that, yes, we do not want those properties to not to be available to our residents, but there's only so much a council can do without support from government. But we will explore all options. Okay, thank you.
Let's move on because it's 8 o'clock and we've got a lot to hear.
Councillor Patrick, I just wanted to say good evening. I'm 1%, but I'm going to leave the meeting if that's okay. Happy to take questions after tonight.
I've got another meeting to go to, so yes, that's absolutely fine. I'm going to move on to Steve Waddington, who's the Strategic Housing Director, and Councillor Mackenzie, who are going to talk about retrofitting our own housing stock and how we can make that stock greener, meet the carbon net zero targets of the council.
Thank you, Chair, and good evening, everyone. If we can move on the slide 1, please. Whoever's got control of the slides. Brilliant, thank you. So yeah, looking at the council stock, and as Deirdre has just said, we've got a retrofit mountain to climb ourselves. But when we look at direct emissions from communal heating, electrics, they constitute the majority of the council's direct carbon emissions. When we're dealing with heating and power emissions from our stock, it's indirect impact we can have there. We don't control in the main actually what residents use, but obviously we have a significant influence over them with regards to the building fabric, the heating systems that are installed, and obviously we have influence over leaseholders as well. The little graph or little thing on the right hand side shows you that actually when we're looking at moving towards net zero, and the first stage of that is moving to EPC 3C, we have roughly 50%, slightly over 50% of our stock that already meets EPC 3. But like I said, we do have 30,000 properties when we look at our council stock and leaseholder stock that we're talking about. If we can move on one slide, please. So looking at the current approach of how we're looking to move towards retrofitting, we've set the housing retrofit strategy within the context of the asset management strategy. And the asset management strategy was approved a couple of years ago. And the principles within that actually align to the retrofit. What we do recognise is, though, moving from achieving EPC C towards net zero, those principles remain the same, but the level of work that we will need to undertake will increase, and we will need to update the housing asset management strategy as we move through those changes. But the way we're approaching it is what is in some senses termed, you know, the holy trinity of retrofit. So, and James mentioned this earlier with regards to some of the private sector stock. Actually, it's looking at the fabric, and you may have heard the term fabric first. So that's making sure the walls, the windows, the doors, the roofs, the installation of the building itself is as good and as thermally efficient as it possibly can be. Because that's the best way to actually reduce your need for carbon emissions from your heating systems. So it's making sure the fabric of the building is as good as it possibly can be. And then moving on to the services, so actually the boilers, the nature of the boilers that we use, be that moving to more energy efficient. We've talked about air source heat pumps, and looking at how we can utilise that and make sure the services that we install are then as environmentally effective as possible. And then the final stage is moving on to renewables, so particularly around your photovoltaics, your solar panels. They have an impact, but actually it's moving back to actually the fabric and then the services in the first place. The timeline that we're looking at is, obviously we've started this work, we've been doing research, understanding some of our properties and some of the construction and nature of our properties, and that will continue, and we will always be learning around that. And as James said, it's not just the research that we're doing, it's the research that is happening nationally, that's research that's happening with other local authorities, with housing associations, so that we can all share that research and understand. We're then looking to see how we can pilot some of this work. We're hoping to bring forward a small pilot next financial year, but that is subject to a number of things. And then the rollout of that will happen, you know, as we move through the timeline. If we can move on to the next slide, please. So some of the current areas of work, as I've said, we've been doing a lot of research around how to retrofit to EPC C, and we've been doing that work around 13 estates within the borough, which covers 94 of our blocks and a small proportion, just under 1,500 homes. So,
shall I break it? Yeah, sorry, could I just ask, again for clarification, I've just been looking through the report and EPC is mentioned a lot of times, but I can't see what exactly it is. Could you please explain?
Sorry, it's the Energy Performance Certificate. So if we can go back a couple of slides to slide 19. Whoever's got the slides, and another one. You get an EPC, so it's an assessment of the energy performance of the property, and it ranges from A+ down to G, and it's about how energy efficient that property is. So quite often you get, when you do get an EPC certificate, what that does, it tells you what the current energy performance rating is and what is the potential energy performance rating. So my apologies. So, and that picture on the right hand side of that slide just shows where the Hackney stock is with regards to the energy performance certificate ratings.
Further, EPC, and then you've got C. Is this like an average or?
So yeah, if you look down on the right-hand side, there was a national target to get energy performance to EPC-C. So we've got 43.8% of ours at C, 6% at B, and 0.5% at A. So the initial target that was set from a government perspective was to get to EPC-C, which is a minimum of where we're aiming for. But obviously, to move to carbon net zero, we will need to go even further than that.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. My apologies. We can move back a couple of slides. So yeah, so some of the work that we've been doing, the research around how we get to EPC-C rating, and then to move that on even further to get to net zero, is around the preparation for the social housing decarbonisation fund, and that's particularly around what the wave 2 funding that will be coming out shortly. So again, the approach that we've taken around fabric first for our housing retrofit strategy sits with the direction for the decarbonisation fund. One of the challenges we had, which is the reason we didn't bid for wave 1, was that you had to have, it was a very short bid timeline, as all of these quite often are, and you had to have a scheme ready and a contractor in place for the work to be able to start in January next year. And we weren't in a position where we had that because of the ending of some of our capital contracts. So we're working to re-procure our contracts so that we can carry out some of the works to achieve net zero under those contracts. And then again, we're doing some more detailed research into the performance of the homes, because obviously, as you see in the graph down at the bottom, actually the worst, unsurprisingly, the lower energy performance certificate rating you've got, the more money you are going to have to spend, and we're going to have to spend towards achieving that. So if we can move on one slide, please. And some more of work that we were doing, and James mentioned the Green Homes Grant, which is the LAD 2. So again, apologies for an acronym. That's Local Authority Delivery of the Green Homes Grant, and we bid for some funding, and we were successful for some funding for that across and with other authorities in London through the GLA. There are some challenges with delivering against that now, as there has been, and as James has mentioned earlier, with the Green Homes Grant and getting that funding in place. But we're working with the GLA around that at the moment. We've been doing work around, as I said, establishing the performance indicators across all the housing stock. So we need that baseline so that when we start to undertake and carry out works, we can actually track and measure the benefit and the impact that it's having, because one of the fundamental elements of the bid process is to be able to understand where you are, what initiatives and interventions you're putting in place, and then what positive impact that has had. We're also doing a lot of work around investing in skills and training for some of our own staff so that we can manage some of this process. So we've now got 3 qualified in-house staff as retrofit coordinators, and we've got 2 qualified energy assessors. We're continuing some of the work around heat meter installation programs, and we're in the process of procurement for new heating systems contracts as well. So if we can move on one slide, please. So some of the challenges, and as James said, the financial considerations and financial challenges here are not to be underestimated. James put a slide up, I think it was 22,500 average cost. There's been some work done nationally that was published in the housing press a few months ago that suggests the cost is generally for social housing anywhere between £20,000 and £70,000 per unit, with high-rise, medium-rise, flattered accommodation, some of the most expensive to retrofit. So we're looking at an approach to understand what investment we have already got planned over the next 20 years, and understanding what proportion of that investment could potentially support some of that work towards achieving net zero, but a significant proportion of the investment that we've got planned and set in our asset management strategy is non-carbon zero, net carbon zero related. So it is about actually your kitchens and bathrooms. It is about rewires and electrical. Some of those things we might be able to put more energy efficient systems in, but actually a bathroom, and we can link into water retention and use of that, but actually we are going to have to spend a significant proportion of our existing funding. And I think just when we start to look at that, if you think, well, potentially the way the housing asset management strategy works is we work on a 7-year cycle, and within that is estimated to spend £15,000 per unit on average per 7-year cycle. So if we take 3 cycles of that, 21 years, we've got £35,000 per unit. Now, potentially you could say maybe 15,000, and again, please don't hold me to these figures, because I can, even though Deirdre's camera's turned off, I can see her face thinking, no, don't say any figures. But actually, if we were to suggest, 10 to 15,000 of that, because we would include in heating systems in that, might go towards net zero. Actually, we still then got, even if you took a mid-range of 50,000, we still got a £30,000 shortfall per unit. And if you times that up just for the council units, never mind the leasehold units, that's nearly £700 million shortfall on the funding that was currently in the Housing Revenue Account business plan. So there's a big financial impact. We've also got to be aware of fuel poverty, particularly in the short term. Air source heat pumps are being pushed as the potential solution to some of this. But actually, electric is more expensive than gas, even with the gas prices increase. So if we were to suddenly move to all that, we would see household electrical bills and heating bills increase from where they are now, potentially impacting on fuel poverty. We need to integrate all of this work with the fire safety works and understanding the work that's coming out of the Building Safety Act to make sure that work that we do doesn't have a negative impact on fire safety and building safety. We will need to look and work and co-produce some of this with leaseholders, because the same challenges that private landlords have, in essence, in some senses, we will have with leaseholders. What elements of this work are going to be work that actually we can impose and therefore make leaseholders pay for? What element is going to be left actually where it's not mandatory that we do it? So what is the balance that we have there in working with leaseholders? Because a lot of leaseholders will want this type of work undertaking because they can see the benefit of it, but it comes at a financial impact for them. And we need to understand the impacts on residents as we move forward, because again, it's significant amounts of work. And we need to make sure that when the considerations we have, that we are aligning with the industry and understanding and including new technology and how all of that will work. So there's some real challenges and considerations for us. If we can move on one more slide, please. I think there's some real opportunities for us, though, around aligning some of the targets, the research around industry expertise on retrofitting and the existing housing stock. One of the things I'm keen to do, and I know talking to Councillor Mackenzie and the Mayor, is around how we can grow the DLO within Hackney. What opportunities do we have around aligning the DLO and growing the DLO and skills and industries to enable us to undertake some of this work ourselves and to have that skill base within Hackney? I think there's a real opportunity to retrofit this, as I've said, as part of the holistic delivery of works over the next 20 years to make sure we have a cost-effective approach and understand how technology will improve, different solutions will improve. You talk to some experts and what they're saying is the solutions that we will be fitting in 15 years time are not on the table yet. So we need to make sure we don't fit something now and then have to do it again in 15 years time. We also need to take opportunity and understand the opportunity associated with economies of scale that come from this. We know when photovoltaic solar panels came out, within a 7-8 year period, the cost tumbled to 50% of what they were previously. So again, we need to understand that within our holistic delivery. And we need to manage that and develop the optimal retrofit investment routes for housing stock, building in all of that, but also with the lobbying that's happening that James talked about in relation to how we can access any grants and any low carbon heating and any funding. So if we can move on to the last slide from me, please. So some of our next steps. So within the year ahead, the priorities that we've got are to continue laying that groundwork and developing the pilot projects. Like I said, we do want to try and bring a pilot project forward next financial year to start to understand some of that on our properties within Hackney. We're developing that performance analysis. Like I said, it is really and critically important that actually when we undertake these works, we have the performance indicators and the tools to be able to track the impact and the positive impact that it's having, because that will be a significant part of the rationale and the evidence base when we start talking to leaseholders as well. And it will be the same for the private sector around understanding the impact that the work that is undertaken really has. As I've said, we're working through the procurement, making sure we have procurement routes and routes to market in place so that when grant and opportunities does come along, we're able to grab those opportunities. And then we're working to understand, as I said, the retrofit standards and what's the optimal and best way to use that, and looking at the different building typologies that we've got, because we will have different solutions for different buildings. And then further research on the long-term technical possibilities around communal systems. You know, I sit on, and a number of people around the council sit on Hackney Light and Power, and how can we link that in to make sure that we're making the best opportunities of communal heating systems. That's the end of the presentation from me. Happy to take any questions. And Irina Mott from our property and asset management team is on this meeting as well, who's leading this work from housing, who'll be able to pick any more technical questions up than I can answer. So thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Steve. We've been talking in the room, and we think this is such a major subject. We want to do justice to it, and this is. I'd like to apologise to the other officers, but we would like to defer new build homes and the corporate properties to our meeting on the 13th of December. I do apologise to the officers. I've never done this before, but I really want to give this the time it deserves, and I don't think we'd give you the time you deserve either if we carried on tonight. I think we've just been over ambitious and quite didn't realise how long and how much the council is actually doing. That's the problem with having a highly efficient, ambitious council. There's so much to say. I do apologise to the officers.
The thing we could do is show us, we can ask people would be prepared to stay on till 9:30. I'm just thinking we're going to overload ourselves in December if we're not careful.
No, there's only electric cars.
Yeah.
There's not that much on electric cars.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. Okay, I've got Steve Webster from. So I've got Steve Webster from the representing
RLG.
Tenants and Residents Association.
Thank you, Councillor Patrick. Good evening, Steve. Thanks for your presentation. You make some really good points then, some good information. I've got two questions. The first one is, the Council and Housing Services have embarked upon a ambitious and wide-ranging major works programme to upgrade properties on council estates. You're into year 2 of that, and certainly on my estate, that's having a positive impact. What contribution will that make to actually reducing the Hackney's carbon footprint? And secondly, have you quantified that? Are there figures available to illustrate that? Do you want me to ask my second question as well? Yeah, my second question is about leaseholders. Yeah, I think, you know, clearly from what I've seen tonight and what James and yourself and Sam have illustrated, this is going to be a phenomenally expensive program to begin for Hackney and the properties to meet the targets of 2030 and 2050. Yeah, you know, it's going to be a headache and a lot of lobbying of government, and hopefully, you know, at some point, the government will start to put the hand in the pocket and put the money on the table. But I'm concerned about leaseholders. Yeah, leaseholders, in my opinion, you know, contribute. The leaseholders that I support in the casework, most leaseholders are quite happy to contribute to what they think needs to be done, but what they're concerned about is if works are taking place which there is no evidence to them actually need to be done. Yeah, I'm concerned that with the numbers that are being talked about tonight, that a lot of leaseholders in the borough are going to find themselves in extremely financial hardship. Yeah, and frankly, I think for a lot of leaseholders, you know, the money is just there's not enough money left in the bank accounts to meet what's going to be asked. So what strategies will you be thinking about to put in place? You talked about co-production and working with leaseholders, but what strategies have you got in place to address some of those issues if they do come true? Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Some really good questions there. I think, as I said, the major works programme, we've got the asset management strategy. We work on a 7-year cycle with regards to that. And as I talked about, we are at the very beginning of this piece of work, so we haven't got all the answers. It would be great if we had. That's why the work that we're doing around the 13 estates, and understanding what would need to be done to enable us to get to that. And that then will give us the information. So we know, as I said, our asset management strategy, the housing revenue account business plan for the council homes, not leaseholders, is based on spending £15,000 per property on average every 7 years. We know within 20 years we are probably going to have to do a heating system, and there's other works that we will be doing to the fabric of the building as well that will impact and have a positive impact on helping achieve carbon reduction and moving us towards net zero. I think you've really hit one of the nails on the head, and it's a piece of work that Irina is talking to me about, and I mentioned it. It's the analytical tools that we have to be able to understand that if you do X, actually it results in Y. This is the benefits that you're going to see, because we have to track that. Certainly from the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund, that's one of the things government are really keen on, is being able to track and understand the impact and the benefits of what you've had, both on carbon reduction, but also actually on impact for residents. So I think part of the work that we get out of that will be some of the evidence base when we start talking to leaseholders, to actually say, you know, this is the bigger picture. You know, at the moment it's not mandated from government, although they've set targets. You know, and as James has alluded to, you know, there's I forget how many households you said there was in Hackney, James, but we've got 30,000 council houses and leaseholders, and I think it's about a third roughly of the stock. James is nodding. So actually, that means we've got 60,000 houses that are either in private sector landlords or in home ownership, and homeowners are going to have real challenges, and as private landlords are as well. So there is a view that somewhere along the line the government's going to have to put its hand in the pocket. The question is, to what level will it put its hand in the pocket, and at what point? So I think I haven't got the answers for you on the detail, Steve, but what I can say is that we're working towards getting those answers and understanding how we use our money in the best possible way. And as we said, aligning our major works programme towards the retrofit. What benefit will it have? What impact will it have? Getting the data that shows the impact on carbon reduction, and then utilising that to actually start that discussion with leaseholders as well.
Thank you.
Okay. Councillor Mackenzie.
Tell him he's on mute.
Councillor Mackenzie, did you want to come in?
He's on mute.
You take yourself off mute.
Thank you. Sorry about that. Yes, I think actually Steve Webster's gone a long way to actually answer the question raised by Steve Webster. I just wanted to just kind of further elaborate on the asset management strategy and the 30-year business plan. At the time of passing the asset management strategy and the business plan, it predates our emergency motion at council to kind of like do all we can to reduce our net emissions to zero by 2030. So, but having said that, the asset management strategy has got incorporated component parts to reduce carbon emissions. Steve asked a question about how much are we going to do within our existing plans. Well, we factored in to kind of reduce our carbon emissions to energy performance C ratings, EPC C ratings. Obviously, that's not zero ratings, but at the time when we actually drew up the strategy, we thought that would go a long way to kind of addressing reducing carbon emissions. To get from C to zero ratings, as been mentioned by previous speakers, we're running into hundreds of millions, and I think actually it's been mentioned it's going to be 700 million just for council housing stock. And remember, we have to, that's in the context that we've already got other really pressing priorities, like our retrospective fire safety works, introducing kind of like upgrading our central heating systems, installing modern kitchens and bathrooms, paying for state improvements and tenant engagement. You know, there's a lot of kind of pressure on the housing revenue account. The money which pays for all of this comes out of tenants and leaseholders' rents and service charges. And as you are aware already, that we are actually struggling, that we're in arrears in terms of our housing revenue account. So just to give you a way of a background, it is a very challenging kind of like environment we're facing. But we are very confident, and this is where the lobbying comes into it, that this work can be done, but it's going to, to pay for all this work, the government's going to have to cough up.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Mackenzie. Yeah, I wanted to, come back to this. You seem to have done a lot of work around our properties, but I wonder whether you've really looked at how many of our properties are used. In a sense, there's an idealistic way of looking at who lives in a property and how they're used, but often due to the shortage of social housing, many of our properties are severely overcrowded. I was just on a call before this meeting where 3 children sleeping in a living room, and the adults are sleeping in another room, which is, I'm sure, not uncommon because we just don't have the properties to transfer. So that leads to properties that are being used more. Washing is dried inside because there isn't outdoor space to dry washing. People are overcrowded, cooking, storage of things. Not that anyone's using their properties in a bad way, but it's just the fact that we don't have the space to move them onto. If only the government would go back to Kent and give us the money to build more properties, I'm sure we could build a lot more properties to move people on and rehouse some of the people off the waiting list. Yes. So I think we need to take that into account. And also, I mean, picking up Steve's point about leaseholders, I do declare an interest as a leaseholder, but it is. I mean, quite a few of our leaseholders, I know some of our leasehold base has changed, with perhaps younger people coming in and buying ex-council properties that were sold to our original tenants. But still, a lot of our leaseholders are perhaps original council tenants who bought, and I think they're perhaps the people that Steve was talking about, who don't have a lot of money to spare and get quite a shock when we send them bills for £20,000 plus. So I do think, I know I've heard that we're talking to the government, and we're hoping the government's going to bring forward this money, but I don't know whether we've got a plan B. I know the House and Revenue account is extremely stretched, as Councillor Mackenzie said. I know Deirdre wants to come in on the money, as always, to tell us we haven't got it. I think we're all aware of that. So I do wonder what the plan B is, and also, to work with our tenants, because the other things I hear from reading the report that was sent to us, there's some very conflicting information about things like heat pumps, so that heat pumps don't heat properties up to the same sort of levels as traditional gas boilers, and then people use backup extra heating to heat properties up to the temperatures they want. Obviously, you have some of the reports say you have to do the retrofit fitting, which you've talked about, and other reports in the London Council's report say you don't have to do retrofitting. So it's all quite, and then there's heat storage, and also making sure, you've talked about, we have people trained to do some of this work, but it's getting people trained to actually fit all these heat pumps. Is there enough heat pumps, even if we had the money? I was listening to the radio today about the Green Government grant, which is most of it had to be handed back. And one of the issues seems to be that there wasn't even the equipment to buy for people that could actually access the money. So it's quite complicated, and it seems to me that we're going to really have to work with our tenants and residents to start informing them of what we're going to do, because so many people are in fuel poverty, and we really need to take that into account. And even moving people up to sea will be better than what they're on now, but we do really need to take that. I mean, as you said, windows and doors. So much heat goes out of windows, and also there's a conflict of planning. I know planning talks about buildings being net zero carbon in the future, but it's getting planning permission for the retrofit and how it's done. And there's the issue of cladding, whether the cladding, if you put cladding on outside walls, whether it's fireproof, people will worry about that. And also, as we heard the last meeting, you weren't here, from Councillor Stocks, about the aesthetics of cladding as well on certain buildings, which may or may not be a major consideration. But I think we heard that Hackney had told some a house association and that it couldn't put cladding up and protect the building because it would ruin the way it looked. So that's a major issue as well. So I'd be interested to hear your thoughts, and if anybody else wants to come in, I'll take Deirdre afterwards.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I think you've raised you know, a lot of the challenges, a lot of the things that we're grappling with at the moment. You know, it is really difficult. We recognise, you know, that there is a housing crisis, there is a shortage of properties, you know, and you know, people are living in overcrowded conditions, and you know, you look at fuel poverty. That's why I've said one of the things that, as part of the strategy to get towards net zero, we need to make sure we're making the right decisions at the right point. You know, and one of those decisions is, you know, the type of services that we put in. So if you go back to the beginning of the presentation when I talked about the holy trinity of retrofit, it's actually getting the fabric right first and then looking at the services. So it may be that we don't do some of that initial work around moving to heat pumps in the first phase, because our first phase is about getting the fabric of the properties as energy efficient as possible. That then might then move us further down the line of the economies of scale around heat pumps or even different solutions. You know, there's talk in the industry, you know, around hydrogen, around different uses, different fuels. There's a whole raft of different options that need to be considered, you know, that we need to really understand as part of that research bit in the timeline to make sure that we're making the right decisions at the right time. And yeah, the challenge of working with leaseholders, working with our residents, you know, I recognise a significant proportion of our leaseholders will be original residents who, you know, have bought their council property and won't necessarily have the money, you know, to be able to pick up this type of investment. That's one of the challenges with leasehold properties under right to buy, you know, and this is a bit of really, again, lobbying government, understanding what investment is available, but also actually some of the challenges will be around actually what is mandatory, what is forced on us and therefore forced on leaseholders as well. So I think we haven't got the answers to all of those challenges, but I think what's really good is that the challenges that you're coming up with as members, that our residents are coming up with, are the challenges that we're grappling with as officers, not just in Hackney, but across London and nationally.
Deirdre and then Casper.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I just wanted to say that as part of the work around developing the actions for the Climate Action Plan, I'm leading the Finance Task and Finish group. And one of the things that part of that work is meeting up with other professionals across London involved in looking and scrutinising the finances and the issue of, you know, affordability generally for the plans, and leaseholders and affordability of leaseholders is on the table. And by working together and working together and examining options, hopefully we can come up with options for lobbying or solutions for how we can support leaseholders, if, you know, either to access funding or other solutions. I think the key thing about the investment in retrofit, particularly around heating systems, is normally if you make an investment, you know, there's a yield. You're lengthening the life of an asset, or you're making some sort of gain which you can pay back a loan with. With retrofit and heating system, it is the tenant or the leaseholder getting that gain. So what we're working together to try and come up with solutions or to lobby government harder with the same messages. So I just wanted to, you know, that's what we're trying to do for the residents of the borough.
Over to Penny.
Yeah, Councillor Rapp.
Okay, oh, do I? Just to try and find some quick wins.
Councillor Rapp, sorry.
No
Can you
sound.
start again? Sorry, there was no sound.
You haven't pressed that.
I did actually, but anyway,
Oh.
I'll start again, shall I?
Yes.
Sorry if you didn't hear me. Okay, so I'll try and be a bit more articulate now. I was saying that it seems that there's a lot of problems here, there's a lot of expense, etc., etc. Seems like a huge mountain to climb. And sometimes when you look at a huge mountain to climb, you just don't know quite where to start. But one way to try and start is to try and get some quick wins, to try and look at where you can make some really fast, advantageous moves. And so I just want to question this strategy of fabric services renewables. It seems to me that if we have to go back to sorting out the fabric first, then we can't get to some of the quick win things, which are the renewables. And I wonder if on some of our newer buildings, we can't just go straight to putting in some of the renewables. For instance, Parkside Estate in my ward has just been renovated rather nicely. It's had new roofs on. Why can't we just go straight to putting some renewables in there? Why do we have to go through the whole process again through the 7 years of looking at the fabric first? And I suppose when I think about trying to get us to EPC grade C for everything, some of the housing we've got, it will take a lot of work to get it up to a grade C. Some of it will be there already. So with sort of looking at putting in renewables into some of those properties which are already at grade C, we get to an A+ with them already. And I just wonder if we might not be able to reach an average of a C quite quickly. And that would be quite encouraging. I'm just trying to look at ways to be a little bit more positive about moving forward rather than kind of tearing our hair out with how difficult it all is. And another thing I was thinking with the leaseholders, you know, one of the things we were told at the last session was that the heat pumps, the most efficient heat pumps are the area ground heat pumps, not the air heat pumps. Sharon mentioned that some of the heat pumps are not as efficient as conventional heating, and people might be tempted to use electric or whatever to heat their homes properly. But I think the ground source heat pumps are actually very efficient. They are also more expensive, but they are the kind of thing where if you were putting it into a whole estate, it could be something which could be sold to the leaseholders as something which is a communal heating contract. And again, it's a very, very energy efficient way of going about things. It is an expensive investment for a start, although spread between a whole estate, obviously rather less so. So again, I just wonder if that might not be a quick win, if perhaps we're not sort of taking this very methodological sort of approach of fabric services renewables. Maybe we could mix it up a bit and make a bit more faster progress, which would be quite encouraging. And hopefully by the time we get a bit further along the line, the government might actually have well, changed, possibly, but you know, recognise that it needs to fork out more for some of those other really huge investments.
Can I edit some?
Do you want me to come back on that now? I think
Yes,
I
please.
think it's an interesting strategy. Irina Mott, who's the person leading this work, might be able to give you some more of the technical detail around fabric first rather than renewables. I think certainly when we look at new build, we should be making that as energy efficient as possible. So that should be built into the the fabric, and where possible we should be looking at those renewables. It's certainly when I talked about fabric first, and I talked about the housing asset management strategy in the 7-year cycle. I think again, as we are doing things, this is about aligning things to it. So whilst we might have the underlying principles of fabric first, if we're going to do a new roof, or we're going to do something, then actually whilst that's up there, whilst the scaffolding up there, whilst the different things, then you might look at actually can you integrate renewables and photovoltaics onto that roof at the same time. So you don't necessarily not do all of it. And I think one of the real challenges from some of the work to support this in the funding is that actually a lot of the funding, particularly from government around the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund, is driven, and one of the principles they want to see is that fabric first approach, because renewables are quick wins in one sense. They're seen as providing a real benefit and doing something, but actually if your fabric is not efficient and you're then losing that benefit, it might give you a quick win that somebody can see, but actually as far as the wider impact, it's not having such a benefit. I don't know if you want to add anything, Irina.
Good evening, everyone. Just a couple of additional points on the quick wins versus the fabric first approach. I think there is definitely opportunities for us to look around a variety of quick wins. Reason why we are actually prioritizing for the year ahead on more research, which covers more than the fabric research in itself. More widely, from a technical point of view, without getting technical, for us to consider a heating system, whether that's communal or individual, that is actually quite low carbon, including the air-ground heat pumps, it is what we generally refer to getting the property ready for such systems, and that boils down to a very basic idea of reducing the power demand first before you are installing such innovative systems. Because ultimately, if you have a very low energy performant building or property, it means that generally the fabric would be very inefficient. As a consequence, the heat and power demand, particularly for overcrowded properties, would be too high for us to enable for these more efficient and low carbon technologies to perform optimally. So I think that we need to be quite careful around these kind of things, and definitely it is on our radar for the coming year to understand more, which is coupled with more work to understand the baseline and which particular properties could we be in a position to target if we are to follow or to pursue such quick wins.
Councillor Olsen.
Yeah. Do I need to do this?
Yes.
What I'm going to say is, yeah, it's a very huge work and huge things. I just want to add some what Penny said. And whatever we do, I think we should definitely concentrate on DLO, which is very important, direct labor organization, plus all those green works we should use it for to create the local labor, local job for local residents. We need to concentrate on this one. Thank you.
Earlier as well, if I get a chance. I've got a question from earlier as well that I didn't get to.
Okay. So I'll bring Councillor Wrighton, who had a question from earlier that we didn't have time for. I don't know if James is still online or someone can try and answer it.
Is James still there? He is, I think, yeah. This is just really a question about the council giving advice to private landlords and private homeowners as well. I suppose as somebody who periodically gets rung up and somebody's trying to sell me some insulation, and I sort of tend to think that I'm being scammed, I think it's quite difficult, that whole business of property improvement and advice, because there are so many scammers out in the market. And I do think that the council could be seen as a source of trusted advice and somewhere where everybody knows where the council is, they know exactly where the advice is coming from, etc., etc. So I wonder quite how the scope of our advice might go to private owners and to private landlords. Could it go, for instance, as far as having a set of recommended contractors? Would it go as far as that or not? Would it be sensible for it to go that far, just to encourage people to actually invest? Because I know that when people are looking at significant investments in their homes, you know, you can get a little bit befuddled about what's going to be a good deal and what isn't, and then you end up doing nothing because you can't just decide on what's a reputable firm to go with, you know. And I suppose, so I wonder how much we've thought about that advice. I suppose the other thing is too, you know, because of the cladding scandal, because of problems associated with damp and condensation with insulation as well, a certain amount of these sorts of modifications to homes do have a bit of a bad name, and we need to try and win back confidence in those things too. So advice which does that, I think, would be very valuable. And I suppose the other thing I was thinking was that, you know, if 85% of our private landlords are actually small-scale amateur landlords, and that means that a significant proportion of those landlords are also going to be homeowners within Hackney as well. And whilst they may be more inclined to invest money in their own home first and try it out and then kind of move on to investing into their private rented properties too. So it could be, you know, really ramping up some of the advice that we're giving could be quite a good way to have quite a high impact on the private rented sector, precisely because we've got so many who are amateur landlords.
Thanks, Councillor Wright. It's James here, if you can hear me. In the order that you raised them, again, firstly, the council does give advice to anyone who asks us around, you know, building works and works, etc., within the private sector. The team already does that. What we don't do is restrict or advise which particular firm or outfit could or couldn't be used. We wouldn't generally do that. A lot of you know, firms we've not heard of, but what we do is we give pointers to people about what to look for. So, for example, the fact that an outfit may well be registered by a professional body, that it offers warranties, that it's in the good electrician guide and things like this, that it is certificated, etc., etc. And we do advise that, and we do advise that constantly. So we can do that. What we could do is, I mean, I would be loath to having a list of firms. There's one way of doing this. We could look at a list of firms that we've that you'd give an approval to, that's some sort of good guide, which we have spoken about amongst us as councils, but we're not there yet. So we have to just speed that up, and we can look at that. It comes back down to the point I made earlier. Frankly, at the moment, we're going to have to beef up simply in terms of resources, our advice function. We do provide advice, we do all that anyway. It's at the moment we simply don't have enough people to advise across the size of the stock and the size of the problems that we've got. So you're absolutely right, advice and prevention are key parts of all of this, but again, I agree, and we'll go through the scrutiny, and we're looking at what we can and can't do in terms of those numbers of resources, and we'll present that to scrutiny anyway. So there's probably quite a good angle from scrutiny here on that. Cladding, you're absolutely right. It comes back to the key point in terms of insulation can cause dampness, etc., etc. It can also be lethal in terms of causing fire and things like that. So yes, we have a whole history here, and we're dealing with that as we speak in the borough at the moment. Buildings have had cladding on them from the best of interest to keep them warm, to keep them dry, and the cladding that we put on there burns, you know, has a thermal performance better than petrol. We haven't removed it now. That's a fact. Again, we've looked at this. We are looking at this. We don't have immediate solutions that, because it costs a fortune, but we are managing this within Hackney as we speak. And again, we'll bring, if I can come back to Scrutiny at a later stage, we will lay out for you where we are with the fire safety and the cladding plans that we've got and have actually implemented in Hackney. But again, that's really key for the future, because as Steve mentioned, that cost to buildings, and it will be in the private sector as well. Some people are facing bills of 70, 80, 90,000 pounds here. Cladding is key. That fabric approach is key. At the moment, unless we get the financing right, I can't see how it will happen in scale as a key point there. Finally, on the fact that around 85% of the landlords are amateurs, again, it's actually quite a proportion of our landlords don't live in Hackney. They actually live outside of Hackney, but have bought or have invested in Hackney or have bought right to buy properties in Hackney. Some do, but some don't. So again, you're right that there's a lot that the team do in terms of advice to those landlords, in terms of advising them. But again, it comes back to this brute point. If you can't afford to invest that, then you're not going to be able to do that. What we are saying to people is hold on for the moment. We've got time. We are lobbying government. We can provide advice in other areas. We can look at things like renewables as well as parts of the fabric. We are doing that, and we do provide that level of advice to people. But our key point at the moment is to lobby to get support into. I mean, Steve said it. This is enormous in terms of cost. There's also the point that I made earlier about at this stage, the kind of contradictory way it's going between if you live in the property and if you actually own it. Again, we've lobbied on all of this. We've made these points clear, and we'll carry on making them clear. But as I say, Councillor Rowett, your question's absolutely correct. We don't have 100% bulletproof answers for them at this stage, other than we need to keep an eye on them.
Just one other point I would say, if you're thinking about a good guide, it does seem like a great opportunity to time what Councillor Rosen was saying about trying to maximise local working opportunities and what have you, as far as we can do, just to keep things as local as we can.
No, I agree. It will allow us to also, grow that local market as well, as we will in time. We don't do it at this stage for various reasons, although we do provide advice on how to select a construction or building firm, for example, without recommending them. But you're absolutely correct. I agree with you.
Thank you. I'm not sure, did Councillor Rosen, did you get your question on the DLO answered?
About DLO, they mentioned before, I was happy to hear about DLO, and then it can be improved, but DLO is quite important, I guess, for the carbon footprint.
Could I ask about the the ground heat pump on Woodby Down, which I gather is supplying heat to some of our properties, as well as the leisure centre, or whatever you wish to call it, and also if we're thinking of using solar panels on our properties as well.
I think with the communal and the solar heat or the system that's in Woodbury Down, I'm not sure if James has got more detail on that from the new build side. I know it's supplying the new is it the Britannia Centre? Not the Britannia Centre. I'm getting confused with different ones. It's certainly supplying some of the properties, and it's one of the things that we're looking at as part of the Hackney Light and Power work to see how we can extend that so that we can make that more beneficial, not just to the new build properties, but actually bring that further into the base of the property, so that we can really utilise and maximise the benefit of that. I think it's with solar panels, it's part of the research that Irina has mentioned that we're looking at to understand, not all our properties are orientated correctly to get the solar again, to make it viable. We also have some of the challenges at the moment as to actually how to utilize that, because at the moment, if we've got a block of X number of properties and we've got one solar panel, it normally links into the communal systems, So we would get the benefit of that, not necessarily the residents. So it's how you can actually aggregate that in a way of being able to do that, so that the residents are benefiting, but then there's challenges as to, well, which residents can benefit from that. So we are considering solar panels where it makes sense to look at that.
Yeah, Steve, so it's James. I'll just come in before I hand over to Chris for a reason. But on the solar panel point, you're absolutely right. Housing associations are saying the same thing. But again, for the panel, solar panels are more complicated than they first appear, because you need the elevations, you need the access rights and all that. So it's a complicated point. But again, we can say to Scrutiny, we are looking at this, and we will come back absolutely on these points. So I'm really looking at the use of solar panels and different types, including generating excess power that we can put back into the grid. So it's something to keep an eye on. You asked a question about Woodbury Down. I'm going to defer to Chris Trowell, who's on the call. I can answer that question, but Chris can answer it a lot better than I can. So over to you, Chris.
So, thank you, James. Nice handover. Good evening, Councillor Patrick and the committee. My colleague Ken and I have been listening intently to this, and we'll look forward to coming back to your next meeting to talk in a bit more detail about the new homes we build. But with regard to Woodbury Down, colleagues will know that's a large multi-phase project. The next phase, or the phase which is just starting construction, phase 3, will be heated through a communal air source heat pump system feeding a district heat network. And what we recognise is that's kind of the best deal that's on offer at the moment, but actually we recognise that in years and decades to come, that will be replaced by different technology. So what's really important is that we and our development partners future-proof that installation, so that the air source heat pumps could potentially be replaced by other forms of technology as it becomes more cost-effective and efficient. And not an exclusive list, but there's the Edmonton Heat and Power incinerator scheme will be pumping heat out. The tube network pumps waste heat out. There's 2 large reservoirs that have a big body of embedded heat, as well as all the ground around this. So the idea is to future-proof the installation, so the pipes and tubes that go to the houses will be capable of taking heat from different sources in the future. And that's pretty consistent with what we're doing on the directly delivered new build stock. Air source heat pump is the current deal, particularly for the small to medium-sized projects where we don't have the benefit of a district heat network. But the plan is that will be future-proofed, and those heat sources could be changed in the future as new technology comes online. More of that next time we meet, Councillor.
Right, this is the last speaker I'm going to take.
She didn't hear you.
Sorry, Councillor Jara is the last speaker.
Thank you. I will be very quick. It's just I wanted a little bit of more expansion from Steve in respect of how deeply the light and power is embedded in the kind of investigations that you're undertaking at the moment. And I think particularly in respect to fuel poverty, and this being a means of future protections against costing fuel rises. I know there's scope to kind of expand the districts. I know Wenlock's kind of covered at the moment and areas like that. I just want to know how deeply that's embedded and what you're doing at the moment, and whether there's going to be scope to kind of roll it out more widely amidst this piece of work.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's at the very early stages of the work at the moment. The research we've been undertaking in housing services is around understanding more of the buildings and what could be done around that. But it is one of the things that we need to build in, as we said, around the longer term strategy to understand, what is the best source of servicing of heating to put into properties. So as Chris has just said, at the moment, actually ground source, air source heat pumps are the most appropriate, the best carbon efficient systems we can get at the moment. If we can develop and extend district heat networks to more properties, then that is a real benefit for us. But we need to build and understand how that may be able to be rolled out, how that can be built into the longer term strategy, and we also need to understand the locations of where those are, and understand, you know, there's a number of technical things within it. You know, understand the heat loss between the source and the final property. So there's a number of bits that we need to build in. It is at the very beginning of the research at the moment, but it is one of the things that we recognise we are going to need to look at. You know, as far as the middle bit of the 3-bit, the services, what's the best way to actually to heat those properties?
Thank you very much, everybody, for the presentations, and I do apologise to the people that we couldn't take tonight. It's been such a fascinating subject. So I'm now going to move on to the minutes of the last meeting, which is item 5, which we don't have. Hopefully there'll be our meeting in December. Part of
I don't know.
Part of the trouble is of us meeting so quickly between meetings is that we don't get time to get to produce. Item 6 is the Living in Hackney Scrutiny Commission work programme, which is set out in your papers, and we will bring forward the 2 parts of today's agenda to the next meeting in December, and I do apologise once again to people, and we will add that onto our discussion with electric cars and electric cars and electric charging in the borough. That's our December meeting. Our January meeting is fire safety and the private rented sector, and an update on the council's licensing scheme. And our February meeting is joint meeting with Scrutiny Commission on the housing needs of young people leaving care. And our final meeting in March is a meeting about leisure services and facilities, and looking at charging of our facilities, different rates of charging, access, how people get access to our facilities, and how they find out about our facilities and what there is to offer. So is there any comments? If not, I'm going to close the meeting. Thank you very much, everybody, for attending. It's been a very interesting meeting.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you,
everyone.
Thank you, Chair. Good night.
You. Good night.
Thank you, Chair. Good evening.
Good night, everybody, and thank you, everyone, for your presentations and bearing with us. Thank you.